Rain fell like whispered prayers across the ancient forests of Eastern Europe, soaking the crumbling stone roads that had witnessed centuries of quiet slaughter. In this world, night did not simply arrive. It descended, heavy and deliberate, carrying with it the memory of every immortal war fought beneath its cover. Somewhere within the pale mist, a vampire coven moved without sound. Somewhere beyond the ridges, Lycans hunted with hunger sharpened by generations of exile. And between them, humanity slept, unaware that its bloodlines had long been the currency of a hidden empire. For centuries, the vampires had ruled from mansions carved into forgotten mountains, their elegance masking a cruelty older than any nation. The Lycans, once slaves, now roamed the wilderness with a fury refined by suffering. Their feud had shaped the modern world in silence, dictating who lived, who vanished, and who was quietly rewritten out of history. Fear was the crown worn by both sides, and neither remembered how heavy that crown had become. Yet, on this particular night, the sky refused to obey the ancient rhythm. A tremor moved through the clouds, subtle at first, like the breath of something vast turning over in its sleep. Then the heavens split. A single scar of crimson light tore across the darkness, burning through storm and stone alike, illuminating the sleeping continent with a glow that belonged to no natural fire. Far beyond this reality, in a world where his name had become a curse whispered by the wicked, Johnny Blaze had been chasing a soul too vile for any hell to hold. The chase had led him through desert highways and ruined chapels, until the road itself began to bend beneath him. His motorcycle roared into a fracture in existence, and the spirit of vengeance was pulled screaming through a corridor no mortal should ever glimpse. When the light finally released him, gravity remembered its purpose. He fell. Ghost Rider crashed into the Underworld universe like a comet forged from judgment. Trees ignited, rocks split. A crater bloomed at the heart of an abandoned valley, and from its center rose a figure wreathed in hellfire, skull gleaming, chain coiled like a living serpent along his shoulder. He did not scream. He did not stagger. He simply stood, silent, as though the flames themselves were kneeling around him. Every supernatural creature within 100 miles felt it at once. Vampires paused mid-whisper. Lycans lifted their heads from their kills. Elder covens felt an unfamiliar pressure crawl beneath their skin, a sensation older than instinct. This was not a vampire, not a Lycan, not any beast their long memories could name. It carried a scent none of them had ever encountered, yet all of them somehow recognized. It smelled of judgment. It smelled of an unforgiving fire that did not merely burn flesh, but weighed the soul beneath it. High above the city, from a balcony carved into obsidian, Selene watched the distant glow bleed across the horizon. Her rifle lowered slowly, forgotten in her grip. She had spent lifetimes hunting werewolves, dismantling conspiracies, uncovering betrayals within her own kind. She had believed there were no mysteries left in the darkness. Yet the flame she saw now spoke a language older than the vampire tongue, and she felt something rare stir within her cold chest. Not fear exactly, something quieter, curiosity edged with warning. In the deep chambers of the mountain fortress, Viktor rose from his coffin with an expression carved from centuries of pride. The tremor had reached even his ancient bones. His eyes, pale and calculating, narrowed at the report brought by his trembling servants. Another elder awakening, he thought. Perhaps Amelia had stirred earlier than prophesied. Perhaps Marcus himself had chosen this hour to reclaim his crown. Whatever the truth, Viktor could not allow another power to rise unchecked. Pride, after all, had always been the sharpest weapon in the vampire arsenal. Far away, in the ruined cathedrals where Lycans made their winter camps, Lucian felt the change with a different weight. He pressed his palm against the cold stone and closed his eyes. There was a heat in the earth that did not belong to any furnace, any forge, or any born beast. It was patient. It was cruel only where cruelty had been earned. And for the first time in his long, sorrowful life, Lucian sensed that a force had entered the world that answered neither to blood nor to moon. In another reality, in a throne carved from suffering itself, Lucifer paused. His attention, normally divided across countless torments, sharpened onto a single missing signature. One of his oldest instruments, one of his most defiant, had vanished from the ledger of damnation. The Prince of Lies rose from his throne, and for once, the flames around him did not obey his mood. They flickered with something like unease. The rider was gone, and the balance between heaven and hell had unknowingly bled into another universe. Back within the crater, Ghost Rider took his first slow step upon this new earth. The soil beneath his boot cracked, releasing a hiss of steam. He tilted his skull toward the horizon and listened. He could hear them, the heartbeat of predators pretending to be aristocrats. The howl of hunted souls remembering how to fight back. The silent screams of countless human generations whose deaths had never been counted. His fists tightened around the burning chain. He did not yet understand this world, but he understood its music. It was the same song sung by every place where the guilty had forgotten how to fear. Above him, the crimson scar in the sky slowly sealed, leaving only a faint shimmer where the rift had been. Somewhere far below the forest floor, something ancient shifted in its slumber, disturbed by a presence it had waited centuries to taste. And across the mountain passes, from a dozen directions, headlights and hoofbeats and silent wings began their journey toward the impact site. Selene rode first, driven by curiosity she could not silence. Viktor dispatched his finest death dealers, driven by pride he could not swallow. Lucian sent scouts, driven by a hope he did not yet dare to name. From every corner of the Underworld, hunters converged upon the crater where a stranger stood in flames that did not warm the night, but waited. Ghost Rider lifted his gaze toward the approaching shadows and waited. He did not know their names. He did not need to. Judgment had arrived in a world that had forgotten what judgment truly meant. And by the time the sun rose, every monster in this reality would already be hunting him, unaware that they had just become the hunted. The death dealers arrived before the smoke had fully cleared. They came the way vampires had always come, without warning, without mercy, gliding through the tree line as silent shadows draped in black leather and centuries of pride. 12 of them, then 20, then a full elite squadron, each carrying weapons refined across generations of war. They believed themselves the sharpest instruments of the night, forged to end anything that dared threaten the ancient covens. Tonight, that certainty would learn its limits. They fanned out around the crater with practiced discipline, their pale faces catching the ember light rising from the burning earth. At the heart of the destruction stood the intruder. His skull glowed with a slow, patient fire. His leather jacket smoked without burning. The chain across his shoulder pulsed like a living vein of molten steel. He did not turn to look at them. He simply waited, as though he had been expecting worse. The squadron leader raised a gloved hand. Silver rounds slid into chambers with soft, deliberate clicks. Ancient blades hissed free of their sheaths. A whispered command passed through the line, and every rifle rose in unison. In any other night, in any other war, the sound of that command had always been the last thing their enemies ever heard. Then the volley came, a storm of silver and precision that would have shredded any werewolf into ruin. The bullets struck true. Every shot found its mark, and every shot melted before it reached the flesh beneath the flame. Streaks of molten silver hissed to the ground like weeping metal, cooling into useless pools around the rider's boots. He tilted his skull slightly, as if mildly disappointed. The death dealers hesitated. Hesitation, in their world, was a rare and forbidden thing. Yet not one of them had ever seen weapons betray them so completely. The squadron leader snarled a second command, and the swordsmen advanced, moving with the unnatural speed only immortals could summon. Blades that had beheaded Lycan warlords carved through the air, aiming for the throat, the spine, the heart. Steel touched hellfire and screamed. The blades dissolved before they could bite, their edges curling into ash, their hilts glowing red in the hands of warriors suddenly aware that their weapons were no longer weapons. Ghost Rider still had not moved. He allowed them their fury, allowed them their disbelief, allowed them one long, silent moment to understand that they had brought hunters to a place where only the judged were welcome. Then he moved, not quickly, not violently. He simply turned his head, and the closest death dealer stopped breathing. The vampire's eyes rolled back as the Penance Stare found the shape of his soul, and centuries of quiet cruelties, of unrecorded murders, of laughter at human suffering, unfolded inside him all at once. He crumpled without a sound, ash spilling from his mouth, his weapons falling from fingers that no longer remembered how to grip. He was not dead. He was simply broken by the weight of himself. The line wavered. For the first time in their long, arrogant history, the death dealers understood fear as their victims had always understood it. Some retreated, some froze. A few, driven by pride older than reason, charged. Ghost Rider met them with slow, unhurried judgment. The chain rose from his shoulder and cracked across the ground, and where it struck, the earth remembered every drop of blood spilled upon it. Fire climbed the links like a serpent, and the vampires it touched screamed in a register that had nothing to do with pain. Yet even as the rider dismantled their advance, something shifted in his stance. His skull turned sharply toward the ridge. On the far slope, a group of humans, farmers most likely, had emerged from a hidden cellar, drawn by the impossible light. Among the retreating vampires, one snarling brute broke rank, deciding that if his coven could not eat the intruder, he would at least feed on softer prey. He lunged toward the terrified villagers with fangs bared, hungry for a life he considered his by ancient right. He did not reach them. Ghost Rider moved for the first time with true speed, and the world blurred. A pillar of hellfire rose from the earth beneath the fleeing vampire, catching him mid-stride. He did not burn like flesh. He burned like memory. Every innocent he had ever drained ignited around him in flickering silhouettes, until the fire consumed both him and the record of him, leaving nothing but a scorch mark on the road and a silence that felt strangely holy. From a ridge above, Selene watched it all. She had followed the smoke alone, ignoring Viktor's orders. She had expected a monster. Instead, she saw something far more dangerous. This creature had chosen. He had allowed the retreating cowards to live, killed only those who advanced, and executed the one who turned his hunger toward the helpless. It was not slaughter. It was law. It was the kind of justice her world had abandoned so long ago it had forgotten the word. Deep in a hidden Lycan camp, Lucian received word through breathless scouts. An immortal spirit had appeared in the northern valley, and vampire blood burned in his presence. The oldest of his lieutenants urged him to strike now, to use this confusion against the covens. But Lucian only stared into the fire, uncertain. He had spent his life believing vampires were the great evil. Tonight, something older had passed judgment on them, and it had not lifted a finger against the human villagers they had preyed upon. That distinction meant everything. Within Viktor's fortress, the reports arrived like blades sinking into pride. An intruder had shattered an elite squadron. Silver had failed. Blades had failed. The death dealers had failed. Viktor's rage was a cold, precise thing, but beneath it flickered a rarer emotion, one he had not felt in centuries: uncertainty. For the first time, vampires and Lycans in their separate strongholds feared the same enemy on the same night. Ghost Rider stood alone once more in the crater, surrounded by the still figures of the fallen and the ashes of the guilty. The rain had returned, hissing softly against his shoulders. Somewhere above, in the veil between worlds, the seal of the rift trembled again, as though something on the other side had begun to listen. He did not know it yet, but his arrival had already awakened more than fear. It had awakened a hunger that had been waiting for centuries to feed. Dawn did not come easily to Viktor's fortress. Even in daylight, the halls remained dim, illuminated only by candles in cold electric sconces designed to preserve the illusion of night. In the highest chamber, beneath a ceiling painted with the founding lies of the vampire race, the Elder Council convened in urgent silence. Reports of the crater had spread through every branch of the coven, and shame, that quiet acid, was eating through their ancient discipline. Viktor stood at the head of the long obsidian table, his hands folded behind his back, his silver hair catching the trembling candlelight. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His fury moved through the room like a change in pressure, bending every listener toward him. This creature, he declared, was a stain upon the coven's authority. Whatever it was, whatever it claimed to be, it could not be permitted to exist within their borders. Every death dealer, every hunter, every hidden agent embedded within the human world was to be turned toward one purpose: find him, break him, burn what remained. Yet not all shared his certainty. Marcus, the eldest of them, listened with a stillness that suggested older calculations. He alone had walked the earth in the age when superstition and truth still shared a table. He alone remembered the taste of the world before the covens rewrote it. When he finally spoke, his voice held no fear, only fascination. Something had crossed into their reality, something whose fire echoed languages he had heard only once, whispered in the delirium of ancient rites. He did not want it destroyed. He wanted it understood. The council fractured quietly around him. Viktor saw only threat. Marcus saw possibility. The younger elders, uncertain which pride to align with, chose silence. And so the decision remained Viktor's, as it always did, and the order was given. Every asset the coven possessed would hunt the flaming stranger before the next full moon. Beyond the fortress walls, Ghost Rider walked. He did not ride yet. His motorcycle had been swallowed by the rift, and though he could feel it somewhere along the edges of this reality, patient and unbroken, the spirit within him urged him first to see, to listen, to learn the shape of the world that had claimed him. He moved through pine forests and abandoned villages, his boots leaving faint scorch marks that faded by morning. Wherever he passed, birds fell silent, then slowly, uncertainly, began to sing again. He came upon a hollow near a river where the earth still remembered a slaughter. Farmers, decades ago, had been drained one by one and buried beneath the roots of the oldest tree. He knelt, placed a burning palm upon the soil, and let the memory rise. The spirit read every name, every scream, every laugh from the throats of those who had done it. Somewhere in Viktor's fortress, a nobleman feasting on rare wine suddenly clutched his temples as an unfamiliar dread crawled up his spine. He did not yet know his name had just been written into a ledger far older than the coven's. Further along, in an abandoned monastery whose bells had not rung in 3 centuries, Ghost Rider found rooms once used as feeding chambers. The walls still whispered. He read them all. Village by village, decade by decade, the crimes accumulated in his awareness until the spirit inside him burned brighter than the sun refused to become. The rider did not grieve the way humans grieved. He converted grief into judgment. And judgment tonight was becoming an army. Selene followed him from a careful distance. She had lied to her coven, claiming to hunt him. In truth, she watched, hidden among branches and rooftops, studying a creature that behaved unlike any predator she had ever known. He did not stalk. He did not lure. He simply walked, and evil unfolded before him as though drawn by gravity. She saw him spare a wandering group of Lycan pups who fled at his approach, though he could easily have burned them. She saw him kneel beside a dying human and rest a hand upon the man's brow, easing his final moments without a word. She had spent centuries believing mercy was a weakness dressed as virtue. Watching him, she began to wonder if she had been taught to disdain the wrong things. Then came a night that would change her forever. In a small mountain town, a corrupt magistrate ran a quiet operation, selling orphaned children to a vampire noble who preferred young blood. Selene had known of such arrangements. She had ignored them. It had never been her war. Tonight, Ghost Rider walked into the courtyard where the trade was taking place, and the noble laughed at the sight of him, believing his own ancient blood would protect him from any flame. The rider offered him one moment, one breath, one chance to look upon the faces of his victims. The noble did not lower his gaze. He raised his fangs. And so the Penance Stare consumed him utterly, until the courtyard held only ash and freed children. The magistrate fled, but the rider's chain found him before he reached the gate, wrapped around his ankle, and dragged him back into judgment. Selene watched from the rooftop, her hand pressed to her mouth, and for the first time in centuries, she felt something almost like shame. She followed him afterward into the ruins of an old chapel, no longer bothering to hide. He turned to face her, and she braced for the fire. But he only tilted his skull, studying her the way a jury studies a witness who has not yet decided whether to lie. She realized then that he was not judging her for what she was. He was waiting to see what she would choose. Far beneath the earth, in a vault sealed since before the vampire race had a name, something stirred at the sound of every soul the rider judged. It had slept through crusades, through empires, through the slow accumulation of blood that had thickened the soil above. Now, with each act of hellfire, the seal around it cracked a little further. Marcus, poring over forbidden texts in his private library, discovered a passage that made his hands tremble. He read of an ancient devil, imprisoned before the first vampire ever tasted blood, that would rise when a fire from another world came to weigh this one. He closed the book slowly, understanding at last that the covens had never been the oldest evil in this reality. They had merely been its caretakers. The valley chosen for the battle had no name on any map. It had been erased from records centuries earlier, after a Lycan uprising had ended there in a massacre so complete that even the vampires had preferred to forget it. Bones still lay beneath the tall grass, patient witnesses to another era of pride. Now, beneath a low blood-colored moon, that same valley prepared to host another chapter of the same disease. Viktor's plan was simple in the way that only overwhelming force allows. He would gather every death dealer within reach, seal the valley with silver, and drown the intruder in numbers no ancient spirit could outlast. Hundreds of warriors filed into position beneath the trees, their black leather gleaming faintly under the moon, their weapons refined for a war that had never included the possibility of divine judgment. Snipers took the ridges. Blade masters formed a ring. Alchemists prepared vials of sun-crafted poison that had once brought down elder Lycans. Confidence returned to the coven the way it always had, through the comforting illusion of preparation. Ghost Rider walked into the valley alone. His chain uncoiled and dragged behind him, carving a thin line of glowing ash in the soil. His skull tilted slowly from side to side, counting them, weighing them, listening to the whispers of centuries clinging to their skins. He did not stop until he reached the center of the ring. He did not speak. He waited, as if giving each of them one last moment to remember their names before the fire chose which of those names deserved to be spoken again. Viktor watched from a hidden vantage above, cloaked in shadow and pride. He raised his hand. He lowered it, and the storm began. Silver rained from every direction. Blades converged. Alchemical fire flared in arcs of pale green. The valley became a cauldron of speed and noise, hundreds of immortals moving as one blade honed by centuries of drill. In any other war against any other foe, this would have been the end. Tonight, it was merely the beginning of a lesson. Hellfire erupted from the ground beneath the rider's feet, expanding in slow, patient rings that did not consume the earth beneath but the guilt above it. The first wave of death dealers to touch the flame did not simply burn. They ignited from the inside. Every village they had raised, every human they had drained, every mother they had orphaned, rose within their skin as living silhouettes of fire. They screamed in voices that did not entirely belong to them, and when they collapsed, the ashes glowed faintly with the imprint of their victims' faces. Those who had killed less burned less. Those who had killed cleanly, out of necessity, felt only heat. Those who had killed with cruelty were unmade by the memory of what cruelty truly cost. The valley became a court, and every warrior stood trial in the same instant. There were no jurors but the flames, and the flames could not be bribed. Selene descended from the ridge before she fully understood why. She landed lightly at the edge of the ring, her guns drawn, her expression unreadable. She raised her weapons not toward the rider but toward her own kind. A death dealer beside her, one who had once mentored her in the ancient combat forms, stared at her in disbelief. She met his eyes and, for the first time in her long life, refused to lower them. When he lunged, she fired without hesitation. The bullet did not kill him. The moment did. He collapsed as much from betrayal as from silver. Around her, the rider fought like judgment given form. His chain snapped through the air, catching a blade master mid-strike and coiling around him until the flames read his ledger. He caught a bullet between two fingers and returned it to the sniper who fired it, and the sniper fell from the ridge without a sound. He walked forward through a wall of alchemical fire as though it were mist, and where the mist parted, 3 of Viktor's finest assassins realized their masks had been more honest than they were. The Penance Stare took them in a single sweeping glance. Far above the valley, on a broken ridge where old bones still lay half-buried, Lucian watched with the surviving core of his Lycan warriors. They had come expecting to strike the vampires from behind while their enemies were distracted. Instead, they lowered their weapons and simply watched. The Lycans had spent lifetimes waiting for justice against the covens, and now that justice was here, they realized it did not belong to them. It belonged to something older, fairer, and more terrible than their revenge could ever have been. Lucian felt the shift in his warriors before he saw it. Some wept openly, others knelt. A few, unable to reconcile the vision below with the hatred that had defined them, turned away entirely. Lucian understood then that vengeance had always been a smaller thing than he had believed. Watching the rider, he saw for the first time what he had truly wanted all along. Not the death of his enemies, the end of their impunity. Viktor watched from his hidden vantage as his army thinned like snow in a sudden thaw. He had never known this feeling before. It was not fear exactly, for fear required uncertainty, and Viktor was certain of what he saw. It was humiliation, ancient and unfamiliar, dressed in the shape of failure. He turned away before the last of his death dealers fell, unwilling to witness the completion of his own defeat, already scheming how to recast this loss into a story his pride could survive. When the valley finally stilled, the rider stood at its center once more, ringed by ashes and silence. Selene stood at his side, breathing heavily, her weapons lowered. Neither spoke. Above them, the sky trembled again, faintly, as if something buried deep had felt the meal of judgment and stirred toward it. Beneath a distant, forgotten monastery, a stone slab covered in symbols older than the vampire race began to crack from the inside. Marcus, alone in his library, felt the vibration through the walls of his fortress. He set down his quill. He closed his eyes. He whispered a name he had hoped never to speak aloud, and in the deepest vaults of the earth, something ancient smiled for the first time in 1,000 years. Marcus descended alone into the vaults beneath his private estate. No servants, no guards. Only a single lantern and the weight of a memory older than the coven's pride. The stairs grew narrower the deeper he went, their carvings shifting from vampire script into symbols no living tongue could read. He had built this fortress atop the ruins on purpose, believing that keeping the old horrors close would keep them controlled. Tonight he understood that closeness had merely made him their neighbor. At the bottom of the stairs stood a door of black iron, and behind it, a chamber whose walls sweated with something too warm to be water. Marcus lit the ancient braziers with a flick of his fingers, and the room revealed itself. At its center rested a slab of stone the size of a cathedral floor, engraved with a circular script that pulsed faintly, as though breathing. A crack ran through the center of the slab. It had not been there the last time he had visited, more than 400 years earlier. He knelt beside the crack and listened. From within, a voice like rusted chains laughed softly, patient as time itself. Far above, Ghost Rider stood at the crest of a hill, watching the horizon where 3 distant cities flickered with unnatural light. Selene stood beside him. She had not asked to accompany him, and he had not refused. Words had grown unnecessary between them. She had seen too much in the valley to return to her old obedience, and he had judged her long enough to know she was no longer a threat. The spirit within him whispered something she could not hear, and the rider turned his skull slowly toward the east, where a shadow was rising that did not belong to any moon. Reports flowed toward them from the shattered remains of the covens and the scattered Lycan camps. Villages had begun to burn without cause. Rivers had darkened. Livestock died in their sleep. Mothers reported their children dreaming of the same voice, calling them by names they had never been given. Ghost Rider recognized the pattern. He had walked into it before, in other centuries, in other worlds. Something old was waking, and it had chosen this reality's exhausted soil to feed upon. Lucian arrived at dawn beneath a white flag no vampire had ever seen him carry. His warriors flanked him warily, expecting betrayal. Selene met him alone on a stone bridge above a slow river, her rifle slung across her back. They did not speak for a long moment. Centuries of grievance stood between them, and neither pretended those centuries could be crossed by a single conversation. Then Lucian bowed his head slightly, not in surrender. In acknowledgement, she returned the gesture. It was more than either of their races had offered the other in memory. Ghost Rider joined them without ceremony. He did not present himself as leader. He did not demand allegiance. He simply told them, in a voice that scraped like fire against stone, that the rift he had come through had loosened something older than either of their bloodlines. This world had fed a devil for centuries without knowing it, and now that devil was waking to claim what it had been promised. Their war had been the meal. Their hatred had been the seasoning. Their pride had been the plate. Selene closed her eyes. She thought of every death dealer she had trained, every mission she had led, every death she had counted as necessary. She realized she had spent her long life inside a ritual she had never chosen to perform. Lucian's jaw tightened as similar realizations moved through him. Every Lycan uprising, every vampire retaliation, every generation of orphan children had been not history but liturgy. Prayers offered without prayer, to something patient enough to wait a millennium for its supper. Words spread quickly, though not easily. Old wounds do not heal because a stranger names them. Yet the visible corruption spreading through the countryside argued more persuasively than any speech. Vampire scouts and Lycan trackers who had spent decades hunting each other now found themselves side by side in the same abandoned village, staring at the same impossible sight. A church steeple bent inward as though something inside it had inhaled. Trees grew upside down within the span of a single night, their roots reaching for a sky that had begun to weep black rain. In the marketplaces, mirrors began showing reflections that had not yet happened. Marcus emerged from his vaults and did what pride had prevented him from doing for centuries. He sent word to his enemies, not to fight, to parley. He offered his library, his knowledge, and his ancient memory to whoever would listen. Viktor called him a traitor. Marcus called Viktor a fool. The council fractured openly for the first time in living memory. Some elders joined Marcus. Others fled to distant strongholds, believing they could outlast the coming storm behind thicker walls. Viktor withdrew into his fortress with those still loyal to his pride, refusing to see what the sky had already begun to reveal. In the ruins of an old cathedral, Ghost Rider, Selene, Lucian, and Marcus stood together beneath a stained glass window that had somehow survived the centuries. Colored light fell across their faces, painting them in fragments of a story none of them had authored. Marcus laid out the ancient texts. He spoke the name of the devil at last, quietly, so that only those present would hear. The name did not matter to the writer. He had judged too many devils to be impressed by their signatures. What mattered was the shape of the wound about to open and the choice it demanded from every soul in the room. Selene made her choice first. She would fight, not for her coven, but for the humans she had spent her long life failing to protect. Lucian followed, pledging every surviving Lycan to a defense they had never been asked to consider before. Marcus offered his knowledge, his fortress, and if necessary, his life. Others trickled in as the day wore on, drawn by rumor and by the darker rumor of what was rising beneath the earth. Enemies became reluctant allies. Reluctant allies became something closer to hope. Ghost Rider watched them assemble and understood, for the first time since arriving in this reality, why he had truly been sent. He was not here merely to punish monsters. He was here to give this world one chance to remember it could still choose. Above them, the sky darkened further, and somewhere beneath the earth, a stone slab finally shattered. The devil's first breath rewrote the geography of Europe. Rivers reversed their courses for the span of a single afternoon. Mountains coughed dust from summits that had been silent since the last ice age. In 3 cities at once, the sky tore open in slow rotating spirals, and from those wounds crawled shapes that had no names in any living language. They were not demons in the way this world understood the word. They were the memory of every unpunished cruelty this world had accumulated, given form and hunger. Ghost Rider stood atop a burning hillside above the first invaded city and watched columns of black flame rise between the streets. He had ridden here on a beast that was no longer a motorcycle. The rift had returned it to him, but the machine had been touched by his passage, and now its wheels spun with rings of hellfire that scorched the earth without consuming it. Beside him, Selene checked her weapons for the last time, understanding that silver and lead were no longer the currency of this war. Lucian arrived with the surviving Lycan clans marching behind him. They came in a formation the world had never seen from their kind, disciplined, silent, ordered by purpose rather than rage. Marcus followed with the coven remnants that had chosen wisdom over pride, their death dealers now sworn to a battle no ancient contract had prepared them for. Behind them all, in a longer column that grew as it walked, came the humans, farmers and priests and soldiers and mothers, drawn from the villages the rider had liberated during his slow, patient walk through the countryside. He had not asked them to fight. They had chosen it themselves once they understood that the sky above their homes had been leased for centuries without their knowledge. The first great battle broke over the ruins of an old capital. Demonic infantry poured through the streets in tides that seemed endless, their claws leaving frost wherever they struck, their voices sowing dread wherever they screamed. Vampires and Lycans fought back-to-back in alleys where their ancestors had killed each other only a century before. Selene led a squadron of former death dealers through the burning cathedrals, buying time for civilians to reach the tunnels beneath the city. Lucian tore through demonic ranks with a fury that had finally found a worthy target, his lieutenants fighting beside him with the awareness that every wound they took was for something greater than blood. Ghost Rider rode through the widest boulevards, and where he passed, the demonic tide broke. His chain lashed wide arcs of hellfire that unmade the invaders as though they had never been permitted to exist. Yet, even as he cleared roads, more came. This was not a battle of numbers. It was a battle of endurance, and the rider knew endurance alone would not save this world. Between engagements, small moments emerged that would be remembered long after the war. A vampire noble who had once ordered massacres knelt in a burning street to carry a wounded human child through a collapsing archway, dying only steps from the safe zone. A Lycan alpha who had spent decades preaching hatred of the covens threw himself between a demon and a group of vampire refugees, his final breath a snarl that sounded almost like laughter. Selene pulled Viktor's own granddaughter, exiled long ago for defying the Elder's rule, out of a collapsing tower and told her, in a voice too tired to be gentle, that her old life had ended and her new one had already begun. Viktor himself watched the war from the highest window of his fortress, refusing to descend. He had convinced himself the storm would pass, that the ancient devil would exhaust itself upon lesser powers, and that when the ash settled, he alone would remain to claim the world. Pride, in the end, had always been his most reliable poison. When the demons finally breached his walls, he did not flee. He did not fight. He simply stood, waiting for the fire to teach him what humility had failed to. Ghost Rider felt Viktor's fall from across the countryside, a small sharp note in the greater symphony of collapse. He did not celebrate. He did not mourn. He simply understood that the Coven's oldest chapter had closed, and that closing changed nothing about the shape of the war before him. There were still cities burning. There were still children hiding. There was still a devil growing stronger with every unpunished cruelty in the surrounding provinces. He found Selene on a rooftop between engagements, her uniform torn, her rifle slung on her back, her face streaked with soot she did not bother to wipe away. She asked him, quietly, whether this world could truly be saved. He tilted his skull, considering the question in the way only the spirit could. He told her, in words that scraped like ember against iron, that salvation was not something worlds received. It was something they earned. And a world learning to earn it, however late, however imperfectly, was worth defending. Lucian arrived at the same rooftop shortly after, blood matted into his fur along one shoulder. He reported the fall of another city. He reported the survival of another. He asked, without shame, what came next. The rider looked out toward the horizon, where the sky curled inward around a black wound that had not been there an hour before. The devil, he said, would not be defeated by armies alone. It fed on the war. Even their alliance nourished it, though less richly. The only way to end it was to reach the source and impose judgment upon the thing itself. Selene did not hesitate. Neither did Lucian. Marcus, joining them on the rooftop moments later, only nodded, his ancient eyes wet with something older than tears. They would hold the cities as long as they could. They would evacuate whom they could. They would buy the rider the time he needed to ride into the heart of the wound and end what centuries of quiet cruelty had allowed to grow. The rider mounted his burning steed. The chain coiled about his shoulder. He looked once at his unlikely companions, then turned his gaze toward the darkening horizon. In this world, at last, someone had chosen to stop feeding the devil. It would not save every city. It would not undo every crime. But it was, finally, the beginning of the end of a very long meal. Before the ride into the wound, one road remained. It was not a road of miles, but of reckoning. The surviving elders and warlords who had fed the devil for centuries had to be met, one final time, and offered the choice they had denied their victims. Ghost Rider had spared many along the way. He had not spared many others. Yet the crown had escaped him longest, hidden behind fortresses and titles and the deference of terrified subjects. Tonight, those walls would be no thicker than paper. He rode first to the ruins of Viktor's fortress. The gates had been shattered by demonic assault, but Viktor himself had survived, dragged from the wreckage by loyalists who could not bear to see their god burn. Ghost Rider found him in a hidden chapel beneath the ruined halls, surrounded by candles and by the last of his sworn death dealers. Viktor did not tremble. He rose from his makeshift throne with the composure of an emperor, unwilling to acknowledge his own defeat, and demanded to know by what right this creature dared enter his sanctuary. The rider offered no defense of his right. He offered only the choice. Face the truth of every life you have taken, and by that facing, perhaps be permitted to remain. Refuse, and be judged as those you refuse to spare. Viktor laughed. It was a small, dry sound, more offended than amused. He had never faced anything in his life he had not first labeled as beneath him. He would not begin tonight. The Penance Stare found him easily. Viktor did not scream. He was too proud even for that. He simply stood, his eyes widening slowly as centuries of suffering unfolded within him, until his ancient body could no longer contain the weight of what it had refused to see. He collapsed into ash before the last of his candles guttered out. The surviving death dealers in the chamber laid down their weapons. Some wept, others simply knelt, waiting for judgment. The rider looked upon them and, seeing in their eyes the crack through which mercy could enter, walked past them without a word. Marcus met him on the road above the fortress. The eldest elder had come alone, unarmed, wearing not his regal robes but a simple traveler's cloak. He asked for no protection. He requested no consideration. He simply presented himself and admitted, in a voice that had lost every fragment of its ancient arrogance, that he had known enough over the centuries to have stopped some of the cruelty and had chosen, again and again, not to. He had watched. He had studied. He had preserved his own longevity by remaining a spectator to atrocities he could have prevented. Ghost Rider considered him for a long moment. The spirit weighed him. Marcus did not flinch. When the stare came, it came differently. It came as remembrance rather than punishment, forcing Marcus to sit with every silence he had permitted, every act he had failed to interrupt, every generation he had allowed to grow beneath a lie he could have exposed. The ancient elder wept in a way vampires almost never wept, without theatrics, without pride, as a man might weep who had discovered too late that his long life had been a corridor of small betrayals. He did not fall to ash. The spirit read remorse in him, genuine and heavy, and left him to carry it. That, the rider knew, was often the harder sentence. Others came. Some elders sought him out willingly, seeking the release of judgment. Others were dragged before him by their own subjects, no longer willing to protect the crowns that had ruled them. A vampire warlord who had run a slaving operation for 6 centuries laughed at the rider's arrival and was ash before his laugh had finished echoing. A Lycan chieftain who had ordered the massacre of a peaceful vampire enclave 200 years earlier fell to his knees and asked to be judged for it, unable to bear the weight of a memory he had spent lifetimes rehearsing as heroism. The stare found grief in him and left him alive to serve the survivors of that same enclave, if they would have him. Not all judgments were fire. Not all sentences were death. This was the difference that the world began to understand as it watched. Justice, in the rider's hands, was not the appetite of vengeance dressed in flame. It was the measured weight of consequence, matched precisely to the shape of what had been done. Cruelty answered with cruelty consumed. Cowardice answered with the labor of restitution. Pride answered with the humbling of an inescapable mirror. Remorse, real remorse, opened a door that no other force in this world had ever offered its guilty. Selene watched several of these judgments from a respectful distance. She had grown quiet in the days since the alliance formed, and quieter still since the fall of Viktor. She approached the rider one evening on a windswept plateau overlooking a valley where 3 former enemies now shared the same fire. She asked him whether she, too, would be judged before this was over. She did not phrase it as a plea. She phrased it as an acceptance. He turned his skull toward her, and for a long moment said nothing. Then, in a voice softer than any she had heard from him before, he told her that judgment had already begun for her, months earlier, on the rooftop where she had first watched him spare the fleeing and burn the cruel. She had been judging herself ever since. That, he said, was the truest form of the stare. When one learned to bear it alone, the spirit had little left to add. Lucian offered himself last. He did not speak of the massacres he had ordered in the Coven's name. He did not speak of the young Lycans he had sacrificed to buy time in campaigns he now regretted. He simply lowered his head. The rider considered him and finally rested a burning hand upon his shoulder. The gesture said, without words, that Lucian's judgment would not come tonight. His sentence was to lead the surviving Lycans through the years of rebuilding ahead, and to do so knowing exactly what he had cost and what he still owed. He accepted it as the heavier of the 2 possible verdicts. By the time the rider returned to his burning steed, the crowned had answered for their crowns. Whatever cities still stood belonged at last to those who had not built them upon the bones of the silenced. Justice had not restored the dead, nothing ever could. But it had, at last, refused to let the living continue pretending the dead had never mattered. And with that refusal, the world was finally light enough to fight the devil beneath it. The heart of the wound lay beneath the oldest mountain range on the continent, in a chamber that predated every empire whose ruins still whispered above it. The devil had grown too large for any single body. It had spread its will through fissures in the earth, through the corrupted rivers, through the black wounds in the sky. Yet its core remained beneath that mountain, coiled around a stone that had once been the seal of its prison and was now the throne of its rising. Ghost Rider rode toward it alone. The Alliance held the surface. Selene commanded the defense of the 3 remaining major cities, moving between them with a precision no former Death Dealer had ever displayed. Lucian led the mobile Lycan forces, striking demonic advances wherever they threatened human settlements. Marcus coordinated the evacuation of civilians and the deployment of ancient wards from vampire archives that had never been shared with any race but their own. Together they bought time. Every hour they held was an hour the rider could descend deeper. He rode down the ancient roads first, then down the tunnels beneath them, then down the pits beneath those tunnels. His steed did not hesitate. Where the passages ended, the hellfire opened new ones, burning through stone that had rejected every drill and pick for centuries. The spirit within him hummed with a low, almost mournful note, aware of what waited below, aware also of what might be asked of Johnny Blaze before this ride was over. He reached the chamber. It was vast beyond reason, a cathedral hollowed by an intelligence older than architecture. At its center stood the shattered slab, the ancient seal now no more than fragments circling a black shape that was still, somehow, not fully born. The devil's form shifted continuously, a body of coiled shadows and half-formed faces, each face a reflection of a soul that had died in this world without justice. It was not a single evil. It was the accumulated debt of a millennium. It spoke, and the mountains above trembled. It offered him no bargain, no threat, no plea. It only laughed, softly, the way a landlord laughs at a tenant arriving to complain about the terms of a lease he had never been shown. This world had fed it willingly, it said. Every murdered farmer, every drained village, every clan war, every pride upheld above mercy. The rider had no jurisdiction here, it said, because judgment required a wronged party, and this world had wronged itself into its own trap. Ghost Rider dismounted. He did not answer. The spirit inside him rose, brighter than it had ever risen in this reality, and for the first time since his arrival, the chain unwound itself completely from his shoulder, coiling in the air around him as though it were a limb of the fire itself. He walked forward, and the mountain forgot how to shake. The battle that followed cannot be described in the language of ordinary war. It was not a duel of blows, but a duel of weights. The devil poured centuries of hunger against him. The rider met that hunger with judgment weighed exactly to its size. When the devil sent forth armies of half-formed demons, the rider unmade them without turning his skull. When the devil tore stone from the walls to hurl against him, the stone caught fire in the air and fell as harmless dust. When the devil reached inside the rider, seeking Johnny Blaze in the hope of shattering the man beneath the spirit, it found something it had not expected. Johnny was already there. He had risen to meet it. For all his years cursed with the rider, Johnny Blaze had rarely been permitted a moment fully his own. Tonight was different. He stepped forward within the shared body and looked the devil in what passed for its face, and offered it something no mortal had ever offered such a thing before. He offered his own soul, not in surrender, as a seal. He had traded his soul once, long ago, and had spent decades regretting it. Tonight, he understood that the same soul, freely given rather than deceived out of him, could serve a purpose no bargain had ever intended. The devil hesitated. It had been offered many souls across many centuries. It had never been offered one that came without fear. It reached for him greedily, and in that reach it committed the mistake every hungry thing eventually commits. It opened itself. Ghost Rider struck then, and the chain moved with him. Hellfire poured through the opening, not to consume the devil, but to bind it. Johnny's soul, freely offered, formed the anchor of a new seal, one that no ritual, no massacre, no accumulation of unpunished sins could ever break, because it had been forged from a choice made in full understanding of its cost. Above the surface, the Alliance felt the shift. The demonic tides began to falter. The black wounds in the sky slowed their rotations. In the streets of the three cities, warriors who had fought for days without rest looked upward and saw, for the first time in living memory, real sunlight breaking through cloud. Selene lowered her rifle and closed her eyes. Lucian sank to one knee. Marcus wept openly. Even the demons, still on the surface, sensing the source of their hunger being sealed, faltered before the sudden weight of their own emptiness. They were unmade within the hour, not by armies, but by the simple fact that nothing beneath them was feeding them anymore. Deep beneath the mountain, Ghost Rider held the seal in place with a will that was no longer entirely his own, and no longer entirely Johnny's. Something new had begun in the moment of the offering, something that neither heaven nor hell had yet accounted for. The devil roared once, then twice, then finally sank into a silence so complete that even the stones around it forgot the sound of its name. When the rider finally rose from the chamber, he did not look the way he had when he descended. The flames around his skull burned quieter now, steadier, as though tempered by an understanding they had not carried before. The chain, still glowing, coiled once more about his shoulder. His steed waited for him at the mouth of the tunnels, patient as it had always been. He mounted, turned it slowly toward the surface, and began the long ride back into daylight. Above him, the world he had judged, punished, and saved began to breathe again, uncertain of what came next, but certain, at last, that something had chosen not to let it end. For the first time in centuries, morning arrived without a coven, without a hunt, and without a debt. Months passed the way months pass in worlds recovering from something they cannot yet fully name. Rebuilding began quietly. In the coastal cities, humans returned to homes they had abandoned during the invasion, uncertain whether to trust the silence. In the mountain provinces, farmers plowed fields whose soil had briefly turned black and had now, mysteriously, returned to its old color. In the ruined capitals, the last of the demonic scars in the sky sealed shut one by one, each closing marked by a small breath from those who watched, as though the whole world exhaled a little further with every wound that healed. Selene became something none of her long lives had prepared her to become. She led, but she did not rule. She organized the surviving death dealers into a protective order sworn no longer to any coven but to the defense of humans, and to the peace between former enemies. Some of her former sisters refused the new order and departed for distant lands. Others joined her with a devotion that suggested they had been waiting centuries for a purpose worth their skills. She trained a new generation with a discipline unchanged, but with a moral clarity she had never possessed in her prior life. She spoke often in her quiet way of a stranger who had ridden through their world and had left them the only lesson worth keeping. Do not measure justice by strength. Measure it by the choices you make when no one is watching. Lucian rebuilt the Lycan clans not around vengeance but around stewardship. His warriors patrolled forests once feared by travelers, and now protected those travelers from the smaller predators that had multiplied during the war. Old grudges did not vanish. Some Lycans still despised the covens, and some vampires still despised the Lycans, but the loudest voices no longer set the agenda. A slow, cautious coexistence took root, guarded on both sides by leaders who had learned, at terrible cost, what the alternative truly demanded. Marcus, who had once ruled from a distance, chose to remain visible now. He opened his ancient library to any who would learn, vampires and Lycans and humans alike. He spent his mornings teaching languages long thought dead. He spent his afternoons dictating the true history of the covenants, unfiltered, uncensored, unflattering. He said more than once that he owed the world an accurate memory, and that even at his age, it was still not too late to begin repaying that debt. His health, however, faded quickly. Whatever the rider had left inside him during his judgment had also allowed him, at last, to feel the full weight of every century he had watched pass. He did not resent it, he said, near the end, that he was grateful to feel time again. Ghost Rider stayed longer than he had expected. He did not lead. He did not command. He simply rode. He appeared in provinces where old cruelties still tried to reassert themselves, in villages where former nobles attempted to reclaim ancient privileges, in forests where scattered demonic remnants sought new hosts. Wherever he was needed, he arrived. Wherever justice had already taken root, he moved on. Word of him spread faster than his rides, and by the time he arrived in a new region, the guilty had usually already been persuaded, by fear or by conscience, to reconsider their intentions. He preferred it that way. The spirit within him grew quieter with each passing month, as though this world's healing were healing him also. In some way, neither of them fully understood. One evening, Selene found him at the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea. The sun was setting behind them, painting the water in colors that felt gentler than anything either of them had seen during the war. She did not ask if he was leaving. She could sense it. She stood beside him instead, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then she asked him a question that had troubled her since the first night she had watched him spare the fleeing and burn the cruel. She asked him whether he had come to this world by accident, or whether something greater had sent him. He considered the horizon a long time before he answered. He told her, quietly, that the spirit did not always know its own reasons. Sometimes it rode where it was needed and understood only afterward why. This world, he said, had needed a judgment it could not deliver itself. It had also needed, and this he emphasized, to see that judgment did not have to be endless. Justice, given properly, ended. It did not perpetuate itself. It closed doors it had opened. And a world that learned to close its own doors did not need him anymore. She nodded slowly. She did not weep. She had not wept in centuries and did not plan to begin, but there was a warmth in her chest she could not identify and did not resist. She thanked him, in a voice too controlled to reveal how deeply she meant it. He tilted his skull, and something in the flames flickered that she chose to read as gratitude in return. The gateway opened the next dawn. It did not tear the sky open as the first rift had. It arrived softly, a shimmer above an empty field where 3 roads met, patient and unshowy. Ghost Rider rode toward it at a slow, deliberate pace. Selene stood at the edge of the field. Lucian stood beside her. A small crowd of humans, drawn by rumor, gathered at a respectful distance. None of them cheered. None of them called out. They understood, without being told, that farewells of this magnitude asked for silence. He paused at the threshold. He turned his skull once toward the assembled world he had helped save. He did not speak. He did not need to. The chain across his shoulder brightened once, then dimmed, and the burning tracks his wheels had left across the field began to fade slowly with the strengthening morning light. He rode into the shimmer, and the shimmer closed behind him with the softness of a page turning in a book that had, finally, learned how to end a chapter. In the years that followed, his legend grew, not as a savior, not as a conqueror, not even as a monster, though some in distant provinces would always insist he had been one. He was remembered as the burning rider who had ridden into a world that had forgotten judgment and had left it, at last, capable of judging itself. Children heard his story before they heard the histories of the covens. Poets wrote of him with more restraint than poets usually manage. And on quiet nights, in villages once terrorized by unseen hunters, an old lullaby began to circulate, one whose final line reminded every listener that some worlds are not saved by heroes who conquer evil, but by those who force evil to face itself. Somewhere across realities, in a corridor no mortal was meant to see, the spirit rode on. Another world flickered on the horizon of possibility, another wound waiting to be weighed. And behind him, in the reality he had judged, dawn continued to rise without a debt, exactly as he had always intended it should.